Hey mini enthusiasts, how you doing? Welcome back. It's part 6 of Project Sprout, and in this update the main thing we're going to be doing is replacing the top and bottom swivels on Sprout and just checking the wheel bearings, giving them a re-grease. So the main reason we're doing the swivels is just because they're worn out, they've got a little bit of play in them, so I'm just going to fit new swivel kits on both sides, top and bottom. And this is just, it's the way I do it. So I've had a look through the workshop manual. I don't see any difference in what I do to what the workshop manual says. There doesn't seem to be any specific way of measuring the tolerance on the swivels. Certainly the Haynes manual I've got just mentions checking them by feel, really, making sure they're not too tight and not too loose. So by the time you get to the end of the video where I adjust the swivels, if I'm honest, when I look back at it, they look a little bit too tight. But the problem is there's only a finite number of shims you get in the pack and that you can use. And when you're down to sort of the finest shim, which I can't remember now, was 0.05, you'll see in the video anyway. It's either a little bit too loose or it's a little bit too tight. So I've probably gone on the side of it just being a little bit tighter than I would like it ideally. But in my previous experience, and I've fitted, I don't know, tens if not hundreds of swivels in the past, I'd rather have it a tiny little bit too tight, because honestly, you run it round the block for a few miles, you go over a few bumps and bit of turning and steering, and that soon sort of settles it down anyway. So that's me, that's my experience, and that's the way I do them. So the only other thing we're going to be doing is replacing the front shock absorbers as well. So don't these look nice? And I'm sure you're probably thinking, oh, they're a nice set of shocks for Sprout. But I actually took these off Sprout, so I've already done it. So the reason I took them off, so it had these lovely gas adjustable front shock absorbers on it, and it had standard shock absorbers on the back. Now in my mind, I'm returning Sprout to pretty much a standard car. These would be very nice and I'd be pretty comfortable if it had gas shocks on the front and I'd leave the gas ones on the back. But what I don't like, or what I don't want to do, is have standard shocks on the front, uprated adjustable ones, standard shocks on the back and uprated adjustable ones on the front. I'd rather have a matching set of shock absorbers. So the existing shock absorbers come with the car, so I've just reverted back to they're not the original shock absorbers, they're actually Sachs shock absorbers, so they've been replaced at some point, but they're a matching set. So these are going to go on eBay and they're going to fund something else for Project Sprout. Like I say, they're lovely shocks these. I have these on Vinnies, they're really nice, but I'm kind of faced with, do I buy the back ones and then run upgraded suspension, or do I just go back to standard? And I think, you know, if you've been watching the videos from the beginning, Sprout's about going back to pretty much a standard car again. So yeah, let me stop waffling and enjoy this week's video. that's all that stripped down and cleaned up. So we just wire brushed this hub. I'm not going to go as far as painting it. Sprout will be a very nice clean car, but it's not going to be a concourse show car, so there's just not much point really. You'll notice I've stripped the wheel bearing out of it as well. I'm not actually replacing the wheel bearing, I've just taken it out to have a look, make sure the races and the bearings are okay. They're Timken bearings, so I'm inclined just to repack them with grease and put them in. And it's relatively straightforward to do. If you can get these grease seals out without damaging them, you can just re-grease them obviously. These are the old swivel parts laid out up to here. So top swivel, bottom swivel. There is a difference. So the bottom swivel has a spring, the cup, and then the swivel pin itself, and then obviously held on by the nut. And the top just has a cup and the swivel pin itself. You can't get them the wrong way around because one end is machined to incorporate the spring and the other end isn't, so it's pretty straightforward. And we've got the new parts laid out up here. This was a kit, I didn't buy it, it come with the car, so I don't know where it come from. Seems all right. It's got everything there apart from the grease nipples, so I'll have to reuse the old grease nipples and a limited amount of shims. So what I usually do, and what I'll probably do in a moment, is I'll measure these shims out and lay them out, because I'll probably have to use some of the older ones. So there's not many different size shims, there's about 4 or 5 I think, but when you adjust them up you might get to a point where you think, oh, I need a lot more or I need a little more, so you just need to know what size shim you're putting back in. Right guys, so that's the hub all cleaned up now, ready to go back together. I put an airline through both top and bottom grease nipples, or the holes where they are, just to make sure they're free. And I have refitted the bottom swivel nut purely just so I've got something to grip it with in the vise. I've also laid out the shims here and I've measured them up. That's in millimeters. So they start with the thinnest 0.05 millimeters, 0.1, 0.15 and 0.2. And to begin with, it's just a case of chucking a few shims in and just checking the adjustment and working it out from there. So I'm only going to show the top swivel. The rest are the same really. The only difference is the bottom swivel has this spring in it. It is slightly harder to get the adjustment right on the bottom swivel because you'll be forcing up against that spring as well. So you really need to make sure when you do it up, you kind of need to get it to a point where the swivel is locked, not just tight, because the tightness just could be the spring holding it in place. You want to get it to the point it locks and then back off a little bit by adding a small shim. So the first thing we're going to do is just smear a tiny little bit of grease around in the swivel we're going to assemble. Don't have to go mad here, we just don't want it metal on metal when we're building it up. Now I'm sure some purists out there will talk about how they spend hours lapping this swivel and the swivel nut in with grinding paste. Yeah, you could do that. I'm sure it will make it a better fit and it will probably make it last longer. If they're decent quality swivels though, in my mind, you shouldn't really need to do that. I mean, it's probably, you know, if you've got the time to do it, then yeah, great, lap them in. I'm sure they'll last longer, but how much longer, I don't know. In my sort of experience, swivels last somewhere between sort of 25 and 30,000 miles, depending how it's driven. I suppose if you lap them in, they might last another few thousand miles. First thing is just the cap. Which I'm just going to lubricate a little bit. Like I say, if you're doing the bottom one, it has the spring in before the cap. So the cap goes in, just check the fitment. Again, just very slight. We'll grease it up properly once we sort of finally tighten it up. And we want to start with a few shims to begin with. So I think we'll just start with two 20s and see where we are from there. Next bit is the, don't know what you call this bit, it's like the bottom washer, it's like the lock tab, so that locks everything in place, locks the swivel nut in place. That just goes over there. Always make sure these mating surfaces are perfectly clean. Obviously any dirt on those mating surfaces is going to affect the adjustment. Grease nipple in, just need to nip that grease nipple up. I think what we'll do, the first tighten down we'll do without the swivel in, just to seat everything in place. I need to buzz that off just because it's spinning around the bottom one as well. Very handy if you've got a nut gun, obviously. So all we've done there is just seated that lock washer down at the bottom. What did I say we're going to fit in it? 2 20s on it. 2.20 mil they are. What we're looking for when we tighten this up, the actual tightening torque I think is around about 100 Newton meters, but do double check it. Lists it as 94 to 108 Newton meters, so in the middle, 100 Newton meters. And we're looking, when we tighten this up, it's either going to be loose or it's going to be tight that we can't move it. If it's loose, we need to take out some shims. If it's tight, we need to add some shims. When we're doing the adjustment, I never torque it up, I just tighten it up by hand. So that's lock solid with 2.20s in, so we need more shims in there. And we'll start with a big one, so we'll go with another 0.20 in there. And again, it's either going to be loose or tight, and we can gauge it from there. So it's too loose. So at the moment we've got 3.20s in, so that's 0.60. So we want to take a 0.20 out, and we'll put a 0.10 in to make it 0.40 overall. This is in millimeters, it's not old money. So we've now got, sorry, no, we've got 2 20s and a 10 in, it's 0.50, half a mil. And it's too loose. So we can go the next size down, which is 0.05, that will take us to 0.45 overall. Out comes a 0.10, in goes a 0.5. See what I mean about measuring these shims up first, because if you don't, you'll be all over the place picking shims out, putting them in. Is it thicker, is it thinner? Now this should be almost spot on, because remember it was locked up at 0.40 and 0.50 was too loose. So that's probably about right there. It's just starting to catch. If anything, we'd want very, very slightly bigger, but what we will do is we'll torque that up properly and just see that it still moves. That's not bad at all actually. If you have it too tight, what will happen when you turn it, it'll undo these nuts. So we're going to go 100 Newton meters. And I would say that's spot on. So a tiny little bit tight, but that will soon sort itself out. So as long as it's not locked, and too loose is too loose. So finally, grease gun. There we go, squirting out the side there. I'll just wipe it round a little bit round the top. You don't need copious amounts of grease in there because it just makes a mess. What you find sometimes is after you put the grease in, it will be a little bit tighter, but no, that feels fine to me. Cap on, and I've just noticed on new swivels, didn't come with new nuts. Which is unusual, they usually do, so we'll reuse the old ones. And then lastly, remember to knock over these lock tabs. These lock tabs are what stops it coming loose. Now you can lock over as many sides as you want. You could do all the sides if you wanted. 2 or 3 is fine, to be honest. That lock plate at the bottom is bolted in there with the bleed nipple, so provided you've got a couple of sides knocked over, it's not going to come loose. Quarter. And that, guys, is it. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? Now I'm going to refit the wheel bearing, do the bottom swivel, and get it back in the car.